Hello, everyone. Welcome to this at Google Authors Talk. And today we have Ann Lee, who is a senior fellow at Demos, an adjunct professor of economics and finance at New York University, a former hedge fund partner, and a frequent commentator at networks like CNBC, Fox, and CNN. When she worked in China, she was a former visiting professor at Peking University and an economic advisor to Chinese economic officials. And today she is here to talk about her book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China, an open-minded guide to treating our greatest competitor as our greatest teacher. Welcome.
I really want to thank Google for hosting me today. It's such an honor. I flew in from New York, and it's much warmer here. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to come hear my talk, especially to such a serious topic like this, because I know that sex, money, and violence sell, and this book is missing all three. Actually, the other day I was thinking to myself, if my publisher wanted to sell more books, perhaps they should have put on a different cover that was more misleading. Perhaps something with Kim Kardashian walking down the wedding aisle with Yao Ming. That might have been a little bit more National Enquirer. But anyway, I'll get into the book now. Oftentimes, people do ask me, why did I write this book? And it's a particularly interesting question, especially for those who know me, because I had spent at least a decade on Wall Street as a bond trader and a credit derivatives trader. And so I didn't do much writing then. In fact, a friend of mine said to me that I was the only woman he ever met who replied to his emails in one-word sentences. It was either yes, no, or maybe. So obviously, I was very motivated to write an 80,000-word manuscript. And the truth of the matter was that I was very concerned about the direction that the U.S. was headed. And this concern actually started as early as 2005, when I was working at a very large hedge fund. At the time, I was trading credit derivatives and saw many structured product deals come across my desk. And these products are what most people now know to be toxic assets, the ones that caused the 2008 financial crisis. And I had seen a lot of irregularities in these deals. And what confirmed my suspicions were that I had attended some of these broker-dealer dinners where I overheard some of these investment bankers actually brag and joke about the fact that they were able to secure billion-dollar deals, secured with nothing but baseball cards. This was deeply concerning to me, and I even tried to raise the flag with the SEC, suggesting that they investigate this market. But when it became apparent that nothing was going to get done, that was when I decided to leave Wall Street. I had seen previous bubbles, such as the Asian crisis, the internet bubble, and I really believed that this was going to be far worse, and that someone had to warn the public and alert them of what was happening. I went into academia at that point and had proceeded to write a paper detailing how some of this fraud was perpetrated. And I tried to send it to various government officials and the media. In fact, one of my friends who had worked at Fox Business received a copy. And so when I got a call from a Fox producer, I thought that I was being invited to talk about my paper. Unfortunately, she asked me, Ann, can you please come on to debate whether Paris Hilton is a great American hero because she's a big consumer? Unfortunately, I didn't accept that invitation. But that was indicative of sort of the mentality that was going on leading up to the crisis. And so when it finally happened, it was neither surprising or shocking to me. What really actually surprised me was to the extent Wall Street and government having come together. And so when President Obama had Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, the very people that had Wall Street in their back pocket, join his economic team, it wasn't Obama where I was deriving most of my hope for the nation. Interestingly, it was really China. For some of you who may remember, China was a mere backward agricultural society only 30 years ago. In fact, they were written off as a lost cause. So even though China was this great world empire for thousands of years, they had fallen to practically a semi-colonial state 200 years ago when Western nations invaded the nation. And it was very shameful and embarrassing to many Chinese at the time, to folks like Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, who were the Communist Party revolutionaries. When they were intellectuals going to Paris, they experienced firsthand the prejudice and the treatment that was very unfriendly from foreigners. And they attributed a lot of this to the fact that they thought it was because China was such a weak nation. And so they vowed to make China strong. And so this small group of friends turned this kernel of an idea into this big movement that allowed them to eventually take over the country in just 20 years. Unfortunately, when they took over the nation, they did not succeed in making China strong. They in fact did the complete opposite. Because they were so married to ideology, they had many of the wrong people in place. They obviously had some of the wrong policies in place. And so this plummeted the nation into a state where millions of people died from starvation. In fact, more people died from that than in World War II. But fortunately, some of these folks, such as Deng Xiaoping, did not give up the dream of making China strong. They continued and persisted in trying out what would work for China. And through trial and error over many different policies, they finally came together and found a set of ideas that would help put China back on the right track. These set of ideas are basically what I discuss in my book. I wrote this book believing that these ideas would actually be workable in a democratic capitalist society, modified, but there are certain elements that are true for all societies. And while I realize that these two countries are very different, there are also many similarities. And I don't advocate everything China. What I'm talking about are some of the best practices of China that we can learn from. Because all nations have their weaknesses and strengths. And if we only dwell on the weaknesses, we are missing an opportunity to learn about what they do right. Because learning can be a two-way street. They've learned plenty from us, and we can learn from them. Because while the US is a very strong nation, we're still not perfect. We make many mistakes. And so if we can find a way to set aside our prejudices and take the best from the West and integrate them with the best of the East, perhaps we can advance civilization and create a better world for all. So I do cover a lot of ideas in my book, and I'm not going to have enough time to go over all of them. But I would like to highlight at least a couple major themes that I think are particularly relevant in the presidential election year. One of the ideas I discuss is the idea of leadership selection. Today, I think the United States is suffering from a crisis of leadership. Our politicians are polling at historic lows Poll after poll show that. 60 Minutes recently reported that Congress had an approval rating of 9%. And movements such as Occupy Wall Street have been spreading like wildfire. These are very disturbing trends because as soon as a nation where the people do not think their government is legitimate, government could start taking more drastic actions in order to maintain the status quo and keep people in government in power. And we're starting to see signs of this. President Obama had signed a bill into law on New Year's Eve so that any American now can be detained indefinitely by the military without trial, without evidence. And this is actually a serious incursion into our civil rights. It makes it more important than ever now that we get the right leaders in place. And while we've had all sorts of attempts at campaign reform as a way to improve the system, 2008 still remains a record year where private money went into the election cycle. So that today democracy here is no longer really one person, one vote, but $1, one vote. So what can we learn from China in this regard, especially since most people regard the Chinese government as a dictatorship? Well, if you ask many folks outside of the US, in fact, you'll get a different opinion. Some people regard China as having the best technocrats in the world. And if you ask many of the Chinese citizens, they have very high approval ratings of their government. Pew Research out of DC here has conducted research polls, opinion polls in China for several years now, consistently showing that the opinion polls of the government have been hitting over 80%. And this approval rating seems to be in sharp contrast to the protests and the over land grabs in the country. But those protesters tend to be very critical of their local government officials, not of the people who are running the show in China. So how did they get this level of legitimacy among their people? What can we learn? Well, the Chinese have a belief that the honor of running a nation should only belong to the people who have earned the right to do it. This idea of earned authority is very similar to the idea of a corporation where we don't elect a CEO to the top based on some popularity contest. No, the person who gets to run the organization has earned the right through an entire career proving that they have the skills and the knowledge to produce beneficial change. And so if you want to go work in the Chinese central government, you first have to take a competency test by the time you're 35. If you don't pass this test, then you must stay in the private sector. And this is a very difficult test. I personally have not seen it, but it has a pass rating of less than 20%. So right off the bat, they attract a lot of the brightest minds in China to go work for the government. And by having that cutoff, they restrict the conflict of interest that can happen between the private and public sector, something that we've seen in our own government. Now, once you become a government official there, you then are rotated to different positions in the government for 5-year terms, and you can't serve a position for more than 2 terms. And while you're in this position, you get evaluated 360 degrees, a la McKinsey style. And then if you do well, you get promoted. And if you don't, you get demoted, and your compensation reflects that. And they try to do this so that they're aligning the government's roles with the interests of society this way, so that it is about helping produce productive change, not based on money and compensation alone. So for example, if you're a government official, you could be put in a position to be a university president of a major university. Then you must demonstrate during that time how you've improved that institution. Perhaps you've increased the number of foreign exchange programs to other universities around the world. Maybe the number of graduates from the university went up in terms of their ability to get high-paying jobs. So they get measured on a number of factors, and this happens throughout their entire career. So by the time they get considered to be a high-level official for the Politburo or the Standing Committee, they would have already served decades in their nation in various roles, showing that they have produced productive change and have benefited millions of Chinese. So many of these Chinese citizens then view that these people at the top have a collective wisdom, that they know what to do in terms of leading a nation, that they have selected the best people for the job. Now, how can we take that and incorporate into the US? Because I'm obviously not advocating that someone must go through the ranks of government here to become president of the United States. But what I'm saying is that there are certain elements that make sense. I suggest in my book, why not introduce a competency test for policymakers here? Today, the only area where we provide these tests are to our foreign service, who become our ambassadors to other nations. But virtually every other agency doesn't require this. And our system today, where the saying, to victor go the spoils, is more true than ever. When President Obama or anybody else who becomes the head of state will have the Plum book where they can appoint different high-level positions throughout government. These tend to go to people who are probably their high campaign donors or other people who they owe political favors. And this may not necessarily be in the public interest. For instance, President Bush had appointed Michael Brown to be head of FEMA during Hurricane Katrina. This guy had no emergency management experience whatsoever. And yet he was charged to run this thing, and we saw the results of what happened. So I am not suggesting we replace our systems, but perhaps we improve it. And another idea is a thought, well, maybe we should restrict the revolving door. Today, it's a well-known business model where someone can go get elected into Congress or work in a regulatory agency and then leave and go to the private sector, set up a shingle on K Street and become a lobbyist and earn millions of dollars that way. This sort of conflict of interest, again, can be very harmful to the public interest. Another idea I bring up is perhaps we should demand track records of people who want to seek higher office. This could be a great way to vet who is qualified, so that they have to have shown they've led an organization and have provided beneficial change, that they have shown that they have the moral compass to help society. Another major theme I want to talk about is the idea of having long-term visions. Because today, I really worry that our nation is suffering from a disease that I call short-termism. We have politicians who can really only think in terms of two-year election cycles. We have a lot of corporations who have to meet short-term profits demanded by Wall Street. I don't think there are enough people who are actually taking a step back and asking, where do we want to be in 10, 20 years' time? And how are we going to get there? So again, I turn to the Chinese system and say, where can we learn here? The Chinese have institutionalized something called the Five-Year plans as a way to avoid the temptation to have short-term band-aids. I know a lot of folks have dismissed this idea because they associate five-year plans with central planning of top-down and of the disasters under Mao. But what I'm suggesting today is that the way they practice five-year plans now is very different from what happened then. Today, it is more of a goal-setting exercise where the government articulates their priorities of where they'd like to see the economy in the future. And therefore, they set performance targets associated with different areas of the economy. For instance, in their latest five-year plan, 2011 to 2015, they articulate that they would like to see a greener economy. So how are they going to get there? They put specific performance targets, such as they want to reduce carbon emissions by 17% per GDP unit by the time they hit 2015. They want to increase energy efficiency in buildings by 16% per unit of GDP. And the people who are charged with making these changes will have the autonomy to come up with a variety of solutions that will help them get there, that incorporate the power of the private sector. So they will use a combination of carrots and sticks, such as tax hikes on high polluting industries, tax incentives for clean tech, and various other investments that will be very inviting for foreign companies in the US, in Europe, to come in and work jointly with the Chinese in order to come up with these solutions that will help them meet this target. Now, the closest thing the US has to this kind of top-down priority setting is the US federal budget. The OMB basically prepares this for the president that should reflect his spending priorities. And basically they make the allocations to the different agencies. The difference is that there are almost no performance targets associated with how we allocate our taxpayer money. It is the equivalent of a CEO having a strategic plan where he would hand over money to a department and not demanding that they produce any results as a result of having received that money. Now, if we have this situation, it is no wonder that our taxpayer money goes into all these agencies and it's like a black hole where we don't see any results. After trillions of dollars of spending, we still have significant unemployment in this country. We are also the largest spender in healthcare, and yet we have some of the worst outcomes in healthcare of all developed nations. So perhaps if we borrow this idea of setting performance targets that the Chinese use, it might drive more transparency and more accountability in our government to help align what they're doing with the rest of society. I guess I'm running a little low on time, so maybe I'll just wrap up here for now, and then open it up to questions. And I understand there'll be book signing afterwards. So there's a microphone there, right? Are there any questions?
So I actually don't doubt your assertion that China is run by technocrats, at least at the top. I think Hu Jintao is widely respected as a very technical person. My question is, what's really their motivation? Because it appears that in the developed world, as well as in the developing world, most politicians are motivated by money and power, right? So that's why the corruption in the system. So what motivates the top leaders in China, and why do you think there's no corruption there at the top?
I think that it's a way of weeding and trying to find the more enlightened people to come to government. The corruption that we often hear about in China is happening at the local government level, where they are running the smaller towns and villages, like a Foster City or Redwood City, and these people do not take competency tests and do not get rotated around. These people stay in these towns for 40 years, right? And that's where all the corruption is, where they have absolute power and there's no way to kick them out. And that's why the Chinese government right now is trying to experiment with this idea of democracy at the local level in order to drive more accountability at those levels. I would think that the way they attract and motivate these people, like I said, is the incentive system. And it probably comes partly cultural. Confucianism, which has been part of the Chinese culture as well as many Asian cultures there, values scholarship, not because it's supposed to help make you wealthy. The idea is that education and educating oneself is for the common good, of society. If you are more educated and you understand the complexities and you understand how to be a good citizen, you make the society better. And that is a philosophy that I think many of these people hold. And so I actually address culture in another chapter in my book. Yes.
So you mentioned earlier an interesting statistic about the approval rating of, I think it was around 80% or so. And my personal experience growing up, I grew up in a very repressive country with a repressive regime where the approval rating was officially quoted as, exceeding 90%, and the president was routinely elected with 99% of the vote, even though those were basically manufactured numbers. They were false. So I probably am more cynical than some when it comes to hearing these numbers, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. 80% seems like an astonishingly high approval rating, and if true, it's remarkable and good. But I'm just wondering if you have additional thoughts on that.
I would be skeptical too if they were coming from Chinese polling services. But this is actually coming from an American polling service who do similar polls with Americans and find that consistently, around 20% of Americans are approving our government. And so they publish these results online. And so because it's coming from an objective source, I'm more inclined to believe that, and that they can't be manufactured that way.
So you make the case that the top leadership in China is more meritocratic because...
I'm sorry, what?
It's more meritocratic because...
Meritocratic.
Because...
The U.S. or the... I'm sorry.
The top. You make the case that the top leadership in China is more meritocratic because they're not driven by electoral politics, short-termism, and so on. So do you see that like people in remote areas of China, if they have the merit, like Tibet or other regions, can make it to the top leadership of China in Communist Party?
So the question is, do the other people believe they can make it to the top?
Do people believe in...
Yeah, and Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao are exactly two examples. Both of them did not come from privilege at all. They didn't have revolutionary background from their parents or anybody else. They came from the poor rural areas of China. And because they were able to prove themselves over time, get past the test and get involved and prove themselves through merit, they got to the top. And therefore, in some ways, it's almost more democratic because it doesn't rely on you being able to be a billionaire to run for office or that you sell your soul to a corporation. It's about you making it to the top on your merits of your own performance.
Hi. I wonder if you could explain for me what fuels your optimism for the U.S. It seems to me we have one party that is now giving us indefinite imprisonment without trial. We have another that's openly discussing the plausibility of abolishing the Department of Education. And most interestingly, the public of the U.S. show a willingness to vote for these nut jobs. So in a democratic system where people are democratically racing for the bottom, how is it that you're still standing up here and talking about policy and not simply moving to a more sensible country?
I believe my sense of optimism comes from the fact that small groups of people can affect powerful change. And that's why I started out with the story about Deng Xiaoping and his other colleagues. And even if we look at our own history in the United States, we've made tremendous changes and reforms, which started with small numbers of people. And it took a long time. It took many years to abolish slavery. It took decades also to give the right to vote to women. So you have to fight hard for them. And obviously, the folks who benefit from the system today are going to fight hard to maintain the status quo. But if more and more people understand and spread the word, like what happened with Occupy Wall Street, I think that it's possible, and so that is why I remain hopeful.
So if the approval rating is so high, why is there so much censorship by the government? They seem to be hiding things from the general public and brainwashing them. So if they're already very popular, there is no need to do something like that. So why do you think that's happening?
I know that often comes up, and I would say that the government's reason to me when I was over there as a professor was that they were worried, not so much their own legitimacy because they're obviously very popular, but that they worried about people who are trying to be subversive to the government. And this is probably no different than a fear that our government has of Al-Qaeda trying to subvert and recruit people into that movement. And so what have we done? We've actually gone around killing people like Osama bin Laden, right? So I think that this perception of a national security threat is something they view as real, just like we view that putting in X-ray machines at all our airports is a real security threat, even though many people think it doesn't work. So I think it's easy for us to be judgmental and critical about what other nations will use in terms of their policies, but if we only hear one side of the story, it's probably not in our position to be saying they're doing something right or wrong. But if in terms of openness and about this idea of censorship, I would say that yes, it would be nice to see China be more open, and the direction has actually been more open, because back 30 years ago under Mao, everything was state-controlled. There was no private press, no information from the outside, and today is quite different. If you go to China, there are tens of thousands of magazines, thousands of newspapers, hundreds of thousands of books from outside of China that get imported into China so that they can develop a very robust discourse and introduce lots of great ideas from the outside. And when I was there in China, I had witnessed on Chinese TV very serious debates between officials about different policies. Even a friend of mine, he was also at Peking University, named Michael Pettis. He keeps a blog on the website, and he used to work at Bear Stearns as an investment banker, and he even writes on his blog that the debates about the currency and about many other issues are more fierce in China than even here in the US. So I think the censorship is probably overstated in terms of what they do censor. And I would say that some of that censorship does happen here as well.
So in the modern era, most officials in high office in China come from an engineering background, whereas in the US, most of them come from a law background. How do you think this difference affect the policies of the two countries? And how can we have more engineers in US politics?
I'm glad you asked that question because I published an article recently in the American Prospect addressing that idea. Because not only do we want to have a more balanced legislature, it's also even more immediate in our job situation. Today we have 3 million jobs that go unfilled in the United States for 6 months or longer. Most of them are in technical fields. And the hiring managers and the CEOs of a lot of these companies basically say they can't find the talent to fill them. And when you look at what kind of degrees that college graduates are having, in 2010, over 80,000 of them came from performing arts and less than 13,000 in electrical engineering. And so we vastly need to rebalance our talent portfolio in this country. And one of the ideas I suggested was, given that student loans can be so onerous to so many kids, why not provide the incentive of forgiving a student loan if they graduate with an engineering degree or some other technical degree in order to provide an economic incentive for more students to study this area? That could be one way of addressing it. And yes, the character of the debate and policies do reflect the backgrounds of our leaders. I talk about that in one of my chapters called Special Economic Zones. Because while our leaders can debate ad nauseum about whether this policy is better than another policy, they do so without a lot of concrete evidence and results. The Chinese, however, basically say, why don't we just test it out? They have a very scientific approach to economic policy. So that it's very similar to a scientist that says, well, we have this hypothesis. We think it will do this, but let's test it out. And that's what the Chinese do. And they get a lot of the results that are reported by independent observers. And then they decide whether to roll out a policy at a national level. And so if we had more of that kind of systematic thinking about testing our policies, we might have a completely different economy at this point.
So your idea that people would set objectives, measure whether the objectives are achieved, it's a very alluring idea. I like it, except it's got a few major problems. One is you have to set objectives that are achievable. You have to get consensus for the objectives. And probably the hardest, you have to actually have measures that say, yes, we achieved them. Actually, it was our policies that achieved them rather than something that was going to happen anyway. So I wonder whether the Chinese, when they're measuring each other, how accurate they're being. If you take something that was at Mao's level of industrialization, not very much, let in lots of Western technology, you're going to have this rapid rate of industrialization we've seen in other countries, with or without very good government. So do they know how much of the improvement came from good government versus just letting capitalists do things?
Well, obviously, things that happen in an economy are very complex. And even today, many economists get those things wrong, right? They're economic models that miss many variables. I'm not saying that that system is perfect or that you can completely tease out whether it's just policies or some other exogenous factor. But if you look at what happened with China before they started on these policies, they clearly had plenty of cheap labor that obviously were not productive. And if you think that's the only answer, you can still look at Africa or many other places where they are not growing and being as dynamic as they are. So clearly there are things they're doing right that are making sense here. And so I suggest that, hey, if we aren't sure, then why don't we test it out in different areas, right? Our 50 states used to be called 50 laboratories of democracy. Now, why can't we basically turn these 50 states into laboratories of economic opportunity? And there really is no harm in doing it if the federal government and the states work closely together to come up with the right design of trying these things out, because there is no harm in just trying out and trying to find the truth of the matter. So I hope that, does that answer your question?
I guess what I'm getting at, I'm not trying to actually disagree with you. I'm just saying that if we want to do this, it's non-trivial. You just say, oh, let's make objectives, let's go measure them. If you were going to go try to study China and you were going to figure out, well, why are they successful, it may well be part of it, a large chunk of it is due to government. But how do you even tease that out? Because they have a lot of different policies that you're trying. They may have various ones that are better than us. How do we know which ones those are? If the whole country is industrializing rapidly, we can ascribe to the wrong factors and adopt things would actually be worse. So how do we...
Well, my answer is that it always does start with the government, right? Because anyone that succeeds is the result of the institutions and the support network that you find yourself in. Even Warren Buffett had said publicly, there would be no way he can be Warren Buffett as a billionaire if he had grown up in India. You are the product of what is around you and the institutions that the government have set up. All right, well, thank you so much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Thank you.